Okay. Thanks, everyone. And also I want to mention that tentatively I won't be here on May the 3rd. Terry will be doing that class, and she'll be doing it from Hawaii while she's vacationing, believe it or not. In fact, she's doing two classes while she's vacationing in Hawaii. So you're muted, Terry.
To say my ego can't take it if no one shows that day.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to just, well, I got a whole bunch of stuff I want to show you this morning. And we're talking about racial bias, but it is important to understand that when we talk about biases, these are the preconceived notions, preconceived ideas, the tenets of society that you have come to accept and embrace. They are the thoughts that we have about people, places, things, so that we, as soon as we see this thing, we have a sense of what it is we're dealing with based on our biases that can come from past experiences, can come from culture, can come from education, television. I mean, there's a whole host of things that populate our brain with information. And as one of the videos that I suggested, the What the Bleep Do We Know suggest, is that our brain contains millions of pieces of information, but we're really only in touch with maybe a couple of thousand of them. So there's more in there, and it's subtle, and it's often things that we're unconscious about, which Terry's going to speak about, but they're there. And so for the purpose of education, for the purpose of analysis, we break these things down into individual types of bias for the purpose of study. But does that mean that one person just has racial bias, or that's the only bias that's at play? No, it doesn't mean that. As I said before, we can't give someone a blood test and say, okay, this person is infected with this particular type of bias. That's not how it works. And so it's to get to the ideas of things that become deeply etched inside of us and that come forth with just a small amount of stimuli to bring it to bear. Well, when we look at extremes about racial bias, it's fairly easy to identify. You know, if someone's carrying a noose and they're wearing a white sheet, you kind of can, know what you're dealing with. It's really those with a hidden kind of bias who are very difficult to identify and very difficult to reach, because they too are not aware of the bias that they may hold. It's also very important to understand that an individual may have very close friends of color, but they may hold animosity toward a population of color. Now, we're talking about racial issues today, but the same would apply to any ethnic bias, or the bias that I have against good-looking men. Can't stand them. It comes in many different forms. Okay, so but some of my best friends are good-looking people. However, in general, I don't like them because I don't like the competition. Then what I want to talk about is to explore the ways in which bias becomes manifest. How does it appear before us, and to provide some examples about that. Now, last week, we talked about the normally distributed bell curve. This is essential for any kind of statistical analysis, for polling, any predictive models, that kind of thing, based on a theory of statistics, but it's the one that is most commonly used. As you can see, we have out on the extremes the 0.1%. mind you, a lot of what you see on television are the people who are far extremes from what is the average person within the population. So, and it can really skew your view about what's going on in the world, because that's a lot of what is news reporting is, not dog bites a man, but a man bites a dog, something extraordinary. Okay, so in the center of it, though, is the 68.2% of the population. If I'm a marketing firm, this is the part of the population that I care about. Mind you, as we get older, we grow out of that 68.2% so that we aren't really that important to marketers. They want those people 20, 30, 40, 50, because that's the bulk of the population. And so if I'm a political analyst, let's see if this is gonna work for me. Come on, there we go. If I'm a political analyst, I may take that 68.2% and I wanna break it down into smaller groups. I wanna define them what I would call cohorts. I want to find who they are. And out of that 68.2%, I may have people who think in the world as us and them. I may have another group, another cohort, white middle class that leans left. Another one, white middle class that leans right. White middle class that is simply disinterested. So, this would go on, this list would go on and on and on and on. That is really the heart of politics, is picking out the people who are consistent with what you can offer, or even if they're not consistent, to understand what's going on in their mind and be able to frame an advertisement, a position that hits their buttons, their biases, and makes it seem as if I'm the person who's going to represent them. Again, I want to emphasize again that you may like an individual of color while still having contempt for the group of that particular color, group of people. Okay, so it's important to understand that even people who are victims of racism can hold racist thoughts in their mind. Let's take a look at some of this. Here we are. There we go.
Some years ago, I was on an airplane with my son, who was just 5 years old at the time. My son was so excited about being on this airplane with mommy. He's looking all around and he's checking things out and he's checking people out. And he sees this man and he says, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." And I look at the man and he didn't look anything at all like my husband, nothing at all. And so then I start looking around on the plane and I noticed this man was the only black guy on the plane. And I thought, all right, I'm going to have a little talk with my son about how not all black people look alike. My son, he lifts his head up and he says to me, "I hope he doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "What? What did you say?" And he says, "Well, I hope that man doesn't rob the plane." And I said, "Well, why would you say that? You know, Daddy wouldn't rob a plane." And he says, yeah, well, I know. And I said, "Well, why would you say that?" And he looked at me with this really sad face. And he says, "I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. We are living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. Even with no evildoer, even with no explicit hatred. This association between Blackness and crime made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old.
And just from the standpoint of logic, of what would be most beneficial to people, there are numerous studies about how if we really dealt with racial issues and really provided equal opportunity for all, it would benefit all. We have this view of it being a zero-sum game, but there's many studies that suggest no, that all would benefit.
Come to the Daily Social Distancing Show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be with you.
I'm so excited for this conversation. You cannot even understand. I'm excited because this is a concept that I have been preaching to my friends and anyone who's within earshot of me for like the last 5, 6, 7 years of my life. But I do not have the time nor the commitment to do any of the research to back up any of my claims. And my claims are simple. Number one, I believe that racism costs everyone, especially white people, a lot of money, and it costs all of society money. And I've always said to people that racism is one of the craziest concepts to me because it causes the people who oftentimes harbor the belief to hurt themselves. So I welcome you to the show because you've done the work behind this. You've actually done the data science behind it, and you've written a book entitled The Sum of Us. Tell me a little bit about what the book is about and why that title is so important.
I wrote this book because after nearly 20 years of trying to find solutions to economic inequality and our big problems in society, I kept running up against a wall and I kept asking myself, okay, why can't we just seem to have nice things? And by nice things, I don't mean like hovercraft or laundry that does itself. I mean universal health care, a public health system to handle pandemics, reliable modern infrastructure in a country with so much wealth. So I set off on this journey across the country. I immersed myself in the research, and it turns out that racism is at the core of all of our most vexing public problems.
As I've traveled throughout the world, the countries where they have the most fair ideas are the countries where they also have the most homogenous populations, where they believe everyone should have because everyone is like me. It feels like it is easier for people to not believe that life is a zero-sum game when they think that everybody's benefiting because everybody should benefit. Talk me through some of that and what you discovered in your research.
That's exactly right. The book is called The Sum of Us because at its core, when we say racism, it's the worldview that our society is a zero-sum game, that progress for people of color has to come at the expense of white people. $1 in our pocket has to mean $1 less in theirs. And of course, economically, that's just not true. Just last year, Citigroup found that over the past 20 years, the racial economic divides, which are here because of policy, past and present, cost this country $16 trillion. But I kept hearing it across the country when I talked to people. I went to Mississippi and talked to a factory worker named Joey, who explained that his white coworkers voted no to join a union that would have given them better wages and benefits because the mentality was, as he said, if the blacks are for it, I'm against it. That has been the overarching ideology and worldview of many, if not most, white Americans, according to the public opinion data, really, particularly since the civil rights movement, sort of forced them to share the spoils of a country that used to be basically the benefits were for whites only.
You know, you've run think tanks and you've worked in the world of just looking at the numbers. But for this book, you combine the numbers with the personal stories. What have you found is the best method to get a person to understand that racism is costing them money, even though they're the one being racist?
You know, it calls to mind a visit I had with a woman named Bridget. This is a white woman who spent her whole life working in fast food. She lives in Kansas City, and she totally had bought the us versus them, zero sum, anti-immigrant, people in the inner city story. And because of that, I think in many ways, she actually didn't believe that she herself, minimum wage worker, was ever going to be worth more than $7.25 an hour. But she was approached by workers who were organizing with the Fight for $15 an hour. And she went to the first organizing meeting. She saw a Latina woman stand up and describe her life, her bad plumbing in her apartment, having 3 kids and feeling trapped. And she said, I saw myself in her. And Bridget came to realize that it wasn't a zero-sum game. As she says, you know, black, white, or brown, it's not us versus them. For me to come up, you've got to come up too. She said, as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And that movement, the cross-racial fight for 15, has been unlocking what I began to call these solidarity dividends, these gains we can achieve, but only when we link arms together across race, higher wages, cleaner air, better funded schools for everyone.
And so I want to, by the way, in the history class, we're going to talk about Bacon's Rebellion, which I would argue that within our culture established the wedges between white and black and the details around that. However, we talked, hang on, I got ahead of myself there. We talk about the racial divide and that we experience racism in America. And there is data to support that. And I want to quickly go through some presentations about different issues and what the circumstance is for Black people.
Hey you there. So if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Did you know that in 2010, Black Americans made up 13% of the population, but only had 2.7% of the country's wealth? That the median net worth for a white family was $134,000, but the median net worth for a Hispanic family was $14,000, and for Black Americans it was $11,000? Know that the median wealth for a single white woman has been measured at $41,000, but for a Hispanic woman it was $140, and for a Black woman $120? Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing. So if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, did you know that year...
Back to the wrong one there. Let me get to the right one here.
See you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, what would you call it if lifetimes of legal segregation, followed by decades of pervasive racist housing policies, still, to this day, disadvantage Black people in every aspect of life? Because where you live can help decide what food you eat, what sort of jobs you can get, how safe you are, what sort of health care you can get, and the quality of your children's education. Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. And yes, it's really a thing.
Let me get this other one here.
Year in and year out for the last 60 years, no matter what else is going on in America, Black unemployment has been about twice white unemployment. That even if you just look at Black college graduates, their unemployment rate is always twice that of white college graduates. And even if all you do is apply for a job with a white-sounding name, you're 50% more likely to get a call back than if you have a Black-sounding name. Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. I didn't see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism. Is that really a thing? Well, you probably know that today's technology lets the government watch what we do and track where we go more than ever before, so much that privacy is almost a thing of the past. But did you know that the government watches some of us a lot more than others, depending on where we come from? That as recently as 2011, the NYPD was exposed for targeting their surveillance specifically at what they called ancestries of interest. That they've been using our tax dollars to spy on these people's everyday lives, just going to the barber shop and the bookstore and singling them out for constant invasion of privacy for no other reason than where their ancestors were born. Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism. I can see you there. You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, did you know that back in the 1980s, there were less than 500,000 people in the US prison system, but now, thanks to the war on drugs, there are more than 2 million? Did you know that out of every 100,000 Americans, about 700 are incarcerated, but out of every 100,000 black men, over 4,000 are incarcerated? And that one of the many effects of that trend is, combined with felony disenfranchisement laws, it means that 13% of black American men are denied the right to vote. Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism.
One more. I think it's important to understand that when people talk about it, it's not just based on opinion, it's based on a lot of research.
You know, if you're like most Americans, you probably say to yourself all the time, systemic racism, is that really a thing? Well, did you know that out of all drug arrests in America, 40% are not for selling any kind of drugs, but just for possessing marijuana? And that white and black Americans use marijuana at the same rates, but black Americans are 3.7 times more likely to get arrested for it? Did you know that? Do you know what that's called? That's called systemic racism.
And so how do we get to that? Well, we get to that by way of a political apparatus that continues to exploit racism for political gain. Now, we're going to look at a clip from the recent Senate hearings for the Supreme Court. Now, things like the 1619 Project and critical race theory have nothing to do with the Supreme Court nomination. But those single words trigger those narratives that come forth and tell a whole story onto themselves.
Project is closely intertwined with a movement that is called critical race theory. Critical race theory, as you know, originated at your and my alma mater at the Harvard Law School. In your understanding, what does critical race theory mean? What is it?
Senator, my understanding is that critical race theory is it is an academic theory that is about the ways in which race interacts with various institutions. It doesn't come up in my work as a judge. It's never something that I've studied or relied on, and it wouldn't be something that I would rely on if I was on the Supreme Court.
So critical race theory, as you know, has its origins in the critical legal studies movement, which also came from Harvard Law School, from a number of critical legal studies professors, crits as they were known when we were in law school, who are explicitly Marxists. And they find their origins in Marxism, although critical legal studies frames society as a fundamental battle between socioeconomic classes. Critical race theory frames all of society as a fundamental and intractable battle between the races. It views every conflict as a racial conflict. Do you think that's an accurate way of viewing society in the world we live in?
Senator, I don't think so, but I've never studied critical race theory and I've never used it. It doesn't come up in the work that I do as a judge.
So with respect.
what we have is what I'm hoping you'll see is that it's just tossing the phrase 1619 Project, the critical race theory, avowed communist. These are just put out there so that it will resonate with the people that he wants to draw to him, to support him. And that is propagandistic. Okay, Dr. Bordan, you're on. You have to unmute.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay. What we've been talking about today just highlights how important cognitive behavior therapy is, because remember we said we think, we feel, we behave all at the same time. But even though it's all at the same time, one really has to serve as a predicate for the other. So we have stereotyping, which tends to be negative. I was thinking this morning, could I come up with an example of a positive stereotype? And I thought to myself, even a positive stereotype is almost negative because it so differentiates that subset of the population as being different. And very often, if it's something that is extremely positive, it kind of puts down another subset of the population because they're not as smart as this category is. So first we have stereotyping, and that really is a generalized attitude toward a group of people whose characteristics are perhaps different from yours or something that you don't understand. But the brain says, thank you for that stereotype, because that's my shortcut. I don't have to think that much. Sal was telling us about the millions of bits of information that go on in our heads all the time. This makes it so much easier because we see somebody that looks a certain way or behaves a certain way, and we immediately evaluate them. We immediately judge them. We immediately demonstrate, if not physically demonstrate, but mentally demonstrate in our heads prejudice against that person. And then the behavior would be that we discriminate. So we've got the stereotyping, we have got the feeling, the prejudice against, and now we have the behavior, which is discrimination. Why do we do it? What's so great about racism? Why is it practiced? It's such a terrible philosophy. We just saw clips that tell us we don't even benefit from it. We don't benefit from it. Excuse me for just a minute. Apologize. We don't benefit from it. It's socially not acceptable, and that makes it harder to fight because it's underground. That's the person that says, I don't see black. When I talk to Harry, I don't even know he's a black guy. It doesn't even cross my mind. I'm colorblind. No one is colorblind, but when we have those kinds of statements, we pushed racism underground, making it all the harder to talk about it and combat it. Also, we see certain groups that are particularly racist, and we know that the majority, that bell-shaped curve of that group, the vast majority in that middle section, they're undereducated, they're insecure, they don't think well of themselves, but they don't want to admit that. That's scary to admit. I don't like myself. I think I'm stupid, or I think I'm not as good as the next. But if we can put down another population, then that boasts our view of ourselves. So again, it's all predicated on stuff that just ostensibly is so wrong and amoral. To understand racism, we have to understand and we have to acknowledge white privilege, because it certainly exists in this country. It exists globally. And I have to tell you about an experience I had. I was the director of counseling at the United States Merchant Marine Academy, one of the 5 federal service academies in the country. And I was one of the only females that was in charge of a department. And I would be paraded out on occasion so that they could show the world, see, we're diverse. We even have a woman that sits head of this. By the way, they didn't want to hire me. They wanted to hire a man, but he lied at the panel interview, and they found that so unacceptable that they hired the likes of me, a female. But they did ask me this question: do you think as a female that you would be someone that the predominantly male midshipmen would be able to look up to? And I said, and I kind of said it in a haughty way because I was annoyed. I said, role modeling transcends gender. And I thought, well, I just blew that. But surprisingly, I didn't, because the man blew it for himself. I was at a meeting with all the heads of the department, and they had imported this expert in to talk about how we could get the plebes to stay for the second year. We didn't like that there was an increased number who left the academy before their sophomore year. And this guy was so nasty to everybody. I mean, if you asked a question, he put you down. If you did anything, he was unkind. And at one point I offered something, or I had a question, and he couldn't have been nicer to me. I was so embarrassed because it was so obvious that I was a woman and I was going to be treated differently. When I taught up at West Point, the cadets would see me with a man and they'd say, "Hello, sir." And I was invisible because I was a woman. Just wanted to throw those in as anecdotal things because I have experienced the thought that when I open my mouth, I speak for womankind, because I'm the only woman in this classroom. I'm the only woman at this meeting. And if I sound stupid, then they're going to think all women are stupid. And it really was a very uncomfortable, very stress-inducing moment. And if we think that minority status individuals, disadvantaged status individuals have that feeling all the time, because what is white privilege? White privilege is the following statements: I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind. I can do that, no problem. I can turn on the television and open the front page of a newspaper and see people of my race wildly and popularly regarded and written about. I can talk with my mouth full of food. No one's going to think that, oh my goodness, all white people have no manners. I am never going to be asked to speak for my people as a whole. I can turn on television and see stars and shows where the people are not of my race, but a different race. And those who are of my race seem to be displayed in a very negative light. I'm uncomfortable. How about the old, and we speak very often today about racism, but remember, there's all kinds of isms. There's ableism, there's ageism. Many of us in the class, maybe all of us in the class, because we're all older, adults have experienced that invisibility that comes with old age, or people thinking, oh, you're more forgetful because you're older, or even our worrying about it to ourselves. I hope this isn't a sign that I'm, the next stage might be dementia. So we even do it to myself. Just keeping on gender lines, because as a woman, it's there. As a man, I can do a little bit of housework and I'm praised. I can empty my dishwasher and somebody thanks me for doing it. And if I do anything with a kid, boy, am I the king of the place, because again, this is all given to women to do. But part of white privilege is certainly white male privilege, but white females have that privilege too. Another point of privilege is that I can go into a store and I'm not followed. Security guards don't look at me. I'm not profiled in that kind of manner. How many of you, and I think I mentioned this very in passing last week, how many of you, and just think about it to yourselves, how many of you, when you saw Judge Jackson and you heard about her Harvard credentials, both undergrad and law school, thought, affirmative action. And then you dismissed it. You said to yourself, oh, I'm so ashamed that that thought even came to mind. And then we kind of diluted a little bit by saying, well, I kind of didn't think it, but I thought about how many people must be thinking about it. Not I, but how many must have been thinking about it when they saw Judge Jackson. So white privilege, if I'm in a bad mood, as white male privilege, no one's going to say it's your time of the month. And again, in academia, when I was chair, and lots of chairs are females, but still, if you're a female and head of a department and you get tough, you're a bitch. But if a male gets tough, he's a great leader. Or how many times was I at a meeting where I would mention something and it would be marginalized, the comment and me as well. And then 10 minutes later, a guy would say, just in different words, but a guy would say what I had just said. And they would say, oh, great idea. Tom, that was a great idea. So even gender and race, age, religion, there's all kinds of isms and there's all kinds of biases. And the biases that we know about them. And some people have a bias and they don't want to change. Some people have a bias and they need to change. They may not want to change, but they need to change. For example, a therapist. If you can, with your own counseling, understand that you have a bias, or it's so apparent, it's very conscious that you have a bias. Maybe you were beat up as a kid in a poor district and you're afraid of people that are Hispanic. And you know that you are. But you don't care. It's broke, but I really don't want to fix it. And I can live my life with that bias, and I know I have it. So sometimes I challenge it a little bit. I may even go out of my way to be nicer to somebody who's a Latino or a Latina. But I really, that's the way I feel. I was beat up and I don't care. Those are as we were told, those are the easy ones, but so many of them are unconscious. So many of them, our buttons are pushed and we don't know our buttons are pushed. And what underlines racism, what underlines even anger, is fear. And Sal and I are going to talk about the psychology of hate and the psychology of fear. And we're going to know that fear has that underpinning. Racism is the tip of the iceberg. Fear is that huge iceberg that's below the water that we really aren't aware of, and thus making it very difficult to change. So, like, how do we change? If we want to change, how do we change? I think we go back to what that gal said last week in one of the clips. We got to slow down, and we got to start to kind of just slow our thinking down and say, all right, there I go again. I know what I'm doing. I'm thinking ill of this person, or I'm anticipating that this person is going to do something untoward, because I kind of feel that his population is uneducated and not as social as mine and not as refined as I am. But that's kind of hogwash. So I got to fight that. You know, we slow down, we challenge our thoughts, because the thoughts can be so automatic. Because remember, our brain loves those mental shortcuts. We don't have to think too much. See somebody with brown skin, we don't like them. No energy used up there at all. It was pretty fast from, I see somebody with brown skin, I don't like them. We've got to slow down, we've got to challenge them. And we also have to do something that our society is sounding like it's going to fight, and fight very strongly. And that's, we have to educate our young, because as the song in South Pacific goes, and I almost feel like the gentleman that said that he sees sunshine and he starts to think about songs with sunshine, I have to censor myself because I'd like to sing a song from South Pacific. But you have to be taught to hate. Nobody is born hating somebody else, some other person who is a different race or a different religion or has a different philosophy of life. Nobody is born that way. So we have to educate our young. And what's happening now, sadly, you see what's happening in Florida. They're saying, no, we don't want to educate our children until the 3rd grade about people who are trans. Now, I know there's some of you in the class that maybe harbor very negative thoughts about trans individuals, but the reality is that they're people like us. They're no different from what we are. They're no different from anybody else that has a birth defect. Their birth defect, unfortunately, has given them a life of hell. And by the time it gets around to being corrected, the person has suffered in countless ways. But can you imagine when you're a kid and when you're really young, and I'm talking about toddler stage, you know you're different. You know, you think differently, and you hear people, get that doll away from him. Don't let him play with that. What do you mean you want to put on a skirt? You're not, what are you, crazy? You can't wear a skirt. You're a boy. And if I see you wearing anything pink, you're going to get it, and you're going to get it. And can you imagine no education in school that says, hey, you're okay. You're just fine. You're you. You are who you are. No. Our society is now starting to say, nope, we don't want to poison our young with those kinds of details. We'll talk about it in the 3rd grade. Well, better in the 3rd grade than talking about it in junior high and high school or maybe even college, but a little bit late in the game to talk about it in the 3rd grade. And I know that there are people that are thinking, no, she's wrong. It should be taught, but it should be taught in a way that is punitive. What happens when we discriminate and when we are prejudiced? We don't allow ourselves to become acquainted with that segment of the population, because to become acquainted with somebody is to not fear them. And once you don't fear them, then maybe you don't hate them so much or hate them at all, because the fear has dissipated. Because remember, under racism, under hatred is fear. Racism is power plus oppression, control. It's power and control. It's almost like a rape. Rape is all power and control, and racism is too. It's power, it's control, it's oppression. I just wonder a few other points. As I said before, oftentimes people have a lot of self-loathing, and we might loathe ourselves because the tapes we hear played out there are the tapes that we play in our heads. There have been so many studies showing that Black kids, when they're offered a doll and said, which one is prettier, will choose the blonde-haired, blue-eyed doll. The media is getting better, but it's not there yet. And what we need, and I'll end on this note, is curriculum change. We need to educate our young. Back to Uncle Sal.
Okay, well, thanks, Terry. Lauren, I think we can open up for questions and comments and go from there.
I'm just trying to catch up with you here. People can raise their hand if they have any questions or put things into chat. And again, you guys have picked such big topics that I think it takes everybody a minute to kind of digest it all. So Willis has a question here.
Yes, you said that you referred to trans people as having a birth defect. I have a daughter who is gay, and when people ask her, when did you decide to become gay? She says, when did you decide to become right-handed?
That's right. Yeah. You know, probably if you really wanted to know what's normal and you look to the animal kingdom, it's bisexuality. And absolutely, you know, and I forgive me for getting political, but I'm going to get political for a minute. I am so proud that one of my best friends is Ruth Berman, and there is a bill in Congress, the Ruthie and Connie Elder Care LGBT, not the no Q this time, but LGBT senior care bill. Please look into it, and if it's something that you feel you want to see happen, please alert your representatives. But yes, your daughter must be so sick and tired of hearing, when did you choose to be gay? Or another popular one was, what happened to you that you're gay?
Margita.
Yes. In my experience, in addition to all the biases and prejudices we just heard of, I think we need to add prejudice towards nationalities and countries of origin. Mm-hmm. And this is not, you know, a minor thing. Some of us who have been born somewhere else, we may have lived in this country longer than even the person we're dealing with. Unfortunately, we're still having to deal with the same thing. Automatic prejudice, images that people have in their mind, which are often, how shall we put that, not always well-educated, researched, you know, based on factual evidence of reality today. So that often people from another country are automatically looked at as being the same as their great-grandparents or grandparents' generation, as in thought, inclination, etc. And if we look closely, nothing could be further from that. So that is annoying, but also kind of makes you feel like you're being excluded because people do not look at you as a human being, but as a representative of a prior generation you have nothing to do with. And those could be different nationalities, different countries of origin, you know, but I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, good.
Yeah,
good.
May I just say something else, because it's so important. Please don't anybody walk away thinking that trans is the same as gay. The reason I said birth defect is that if you're born in the body of a male and you're a female, you are the essence. Your soul is female, you're female. Yeah, that's the birth defect, that the gender, doesn't agree with the body, or your gender identification doesn't agree with you anatomically. But I hope no one would ever think that being gay is a birth defect. That would be saying that being heterosexual is a birth defect. And just wanted to throw that in case there's any misunderstanding.
Sure, sure.
Jennifer and Graham?
Hi. I just had a quick comment and wondered if there had been any, extensive research into sort of geographical instances of racist versus non-racist populations. I grew up in white bread New England, supposedly a understanding non-racist area, and yet it couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, we had one Black person in the 12 years we were in school there, and that family lasted in the community, I think, about 8 months, and then they were squeezed out. But I then went to Europe, in England, to go to school, and was in classes with people from Africa, Italy, everywhere, all around the world. And there was never any thought about being racist. I mean, you didn't look at anyone as being different. They were just people.
Well, I think one of the things that's really important is that there are people who will think, I'm not racist. I don't have anything against Black people, and I'm open-minded, and I want them to have, equal opportunity and all that kind of stuff. And they feel like they are, enlightened and that sort of thing. If they are in a culture that has infused their brain with a lot of negative things about, be it a person of color or a person of a particular nationality or sexual identity or whatever it may be, if their brain has been infused with that, even though they think, hey, I'm okay with all this stuff, when they get put to a test, city council has just come up with a new program and a lot of these kind of people are going to move into your neighborhood. What happens is those things get triggered and those narratives start to play out. So the hostile feelings emerge, even though that person thought, wait a minute, I'm not prejudiced. So, again, a lot of the population of information inside of our head comes from our culture, our education, our family, movies, lots of things. You can be in a place where that stuff isn't communicated, and so you find people don't hold those kinds of images of others. Mm-hmm. But it's important to recognize that a lot of it are thoughts that the individual may not be cognizant that they even hold.
And again, knowledge. I was teaching a course, and it was a multicultural counseling course. And one gal was born in Shanghai, and she was Jewish, and her parents were Holocaust survivors. And Shanghai was a very welcoming city for Jews at that time. And she sat next to a girl whose grandmother was German and whose grandmother was discriminated against in this country. And it was so beautiful to see the two of them come together and share their stories and be much more empathetic to one another. It's just something that popped in my mind from what the gal said about nationalities. Yeah.
Okay, Ed, I think you have your hand up too, but I first want to go to Kay Strand, who hasn't been able to figure out how to do the raise the hand thing. But if you'll unmute yourself, Kay. Do you know how to unmute yourself? On the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you should see where it says mute. You should see a microphone and a mute button. And if you click on that, you'll be able to speak. Lauren, there you go. There you are.
I just wanted to thank Dr. Bordan for talking about educating our young. We have so many bills, I think, we do in Minnesota, I'm sure in other states, for early childhood education that just, they aren't getting passed. And I work at a homeless shelter, and over half the people that are there, the men are Black men or Native, and just didn't get educated. And it would make such a big difference if we could get these bills passed and get kids started really, really early, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And I have to say that Kay is my bestie, and Jeff is a Marine, Sal. And I had mentioned last time, you know, thank you for your service. So I'm just so thrilled to see Kay and Jeff.
Thank you.
Great.
And
Thanks.
the reason she had trouble getting on was because she's my friend.
I think, Ed, you have your, did you have something, Ed? I think you're out there.
Or Len has
Len, okay.
Len has his hand up.
Am I talking?
Oh, we have Ed up. Go ahead, Ed.
Yes, I think Terry hit it right on the nose with "You've got to be taught." When my wife, who's going to be 80 years old in a few days, grew up in Old Rockaway, and when she was a 10-year-old, she had a Black boy who was really very close friend. And then they, unfortunately for her, moved to Queens. When we got married, we went up to Pittsburgh, and I had my first job. And she was asked by someone at our congregation if she would like to work on housing discrimination. And so she would go with me as a husband, and we would say, "Oh, this is a great place." Or she would go with the lawyer and say, "She's a great place, but I have to bring my husband." Well, when the lawyer got there, the lawyer was with a Black woman, and that was his so-called wife. "Oh, that place is not available anymore. We just rented that out." And so she has lived a very liberal life. And because of that, our third child went to Brooklyn Law School and became a housing lawyer. And she has done very well. And here in Atlanta, she is very active with the Jewish African American Alliance, and some of our grandchildren sat at the Black Alliance Seder, and we were going to do that again. And we have lived a life of recognizing the racism. And I think what you've been talking about, and I've written down all of your experiences, which are extremely vital to understanding the problems that we have. And we love Trevor Noah and all of the things that he has done. So I'm really pleased that I have stayed closely to your program, Sal. I am now at the desk of one of my grandchildren because they are all away, and my wife and I are dog sitting. And so I'm now at my older granddaughter's desk, and she's up in Seattle doing some studies. So thank you very much for all the things that you've done. You Boston Red Sox fan.
Happy birthday to your wife, from one Queens gal to another. Happy birthday to your wife.
I thank you very much.
Carl.
Go ahead.
My experience has been a little bit different from many of you in that I've lived for over half my life in overseas in countries where I was the minority. And my children got along just fine. They had no problems whatsoever coming back to the US, my daughter is finding a very strong prejudice in Atlanta against white people among the Black folks that she has to work with. So it goes two ways.
Oh yeah, no, look, it's not, as the first speaker said, here was her son who's got those ideas. It's not, cuts across all lines that we have biases, we have narratives in our head. Yeah. Absolutely. Right.
I wish there were time today, and there wasn't, for me to go into racial identity and the stages that one goes through as a minority status individual. First there's the being an infant and you're just surrounded by it, but there's a stage where you really over-identify with it and you don't like the other, but hopefully people can grow out of that stage. But just like Freud's psychosexual stages, there can be people that are quite fixated in a stage.
Yeah. Yeah. Len.
Just a comment in the context of this presentation. Both of my granddaughters here in Atlanta attended a preschool called Sheltering Arms, and they have a number of outlets, you might say, here in the Atlanta metropolitan area. And the demographics of the classes were, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and it was such a wonderful experience for them. And I have to say that my granddaughters, now one 13, one 9, have absolutely no, at least demonstrable that I can tell, prejudice, perspective on things. They just don't see race at all in their everyday interfacing with their friends. So I think there's hope, and I think one of the important components of that hope is getting started early in people's lives and giving them the correct point of departure. I'm sure that they'll encounter situations in their life, but if they have the right perspective and point of departure, they can be actors for the positive. Thank you.
No, thank you. And you're never too young for it. That's why the curriculum that is being discriminated against in Florida just really is going to hurt everybody.
Okay, let me just add that I'm a good example of having been trained from birth to hate everybody, and my family did not. We could find something wrong with everyone, and if we didn't know what their ethnic background was, if the person was wearing a black jacket, oh, look at that black jacket wearing SOB. We could find a way to hate just about anyone on the planet. Yep. Okay, well, I think we're about out of time. We're over a little bit. I'm gonna send you out a brief summary of the class, but I'm also going to attach a video from an interview conducted last night after the Senate voted to advance Judge Jackson's nomination, because it's to highlight the use of words like critical race theory and the rest has nothing to do with the confirmation process, has all to do with trying to, by way of propaganda, touching into biases to solicit support. And I'd like you to watch that and think about it. And also to highlight that really the key to understanding the role of propaganda is that it is based on a very sophisticated understanding of psychology and drawing upon that and communicating it in a very sophisticated way to manipulate the mass population. So with that, we'll see you all next week. And
okay, we're going to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thanks to Sal and Terry. And remember, no class next week. Everybody, round of applause.
Okay.
See you in 2 weeks.
We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Great job.